Why do you say that, Father? You aren't afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
Broadcasting live from our Sanctum Sanctorum in bountiful Bakersfield, California. This is the Sixth Sense Society. I'm your host, Krista, here with our producer, Michael. And we are back on air with our first show in 2026 and in, I think, about 6 or 7 months. And today we're going to be talking about our predictions for 2026. And also we have a few new announcements. So I'm going to let Michael talk about some of our announcements.
Hi, everybody. And yes, welcome back after a very long break. And we're looking forward to getting back in the saddle and doing some great episodes. Probably the big news since we've moved to Bakersfield is that now we're doing in-person readings on the weekends at the Enchanted Cottage, which is just an absolutely charming little bookshop and occult metaphysical store here in Bakersfield. Krista's doing Saturday afternoons. I'm doing Sunday afternoons. So if you're in the neighborhood, drop by and say hi. And then don't forget our book, Tarot Alchemy, a Kabbalah-inspired approach to reading the cards, is available on Amazon. Please search under books so you'll never find it. It gets buried. But and thank you to those who've purchased it and those wonderful comments we've gotten about it. It's been really gratifying to get all that feedback. And don't forget, if you're out and about, you can listen to us as a podcast on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please go to YouTube, click like and subscribe so you get notified of new content as we're putting up new videos now. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to Krista. So take it away, Krista.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And one other little announcement. I have a special I do in January. In fact, the prediction I'm doing today is based on the layout. It's a horoscope style layout of 12 cards. So I call it the January Horoscope Tarot Special. And I've been doing it for a little while. It's only offered in January and also comes with 2 animal cards, your ally and your adversary. And as I said, I'm going to be using this today because it's really an interesting spread, and it really seems to at least capture some of the energies. And let's get right into the show. So I'm going to just briefly talk what I'm going to do, and I'm going to let Michael just sort of give an overview of what he's going to talk about. So I'm going to look at sort of the broad energies of the United States. And I decided, since I live in Bakersfield, I wanted to look at Bakersfield, California this year. So I'm using the horoscope spread for both of them, along with the medicine cards. And I might add a little bit of the astrology and of the U.S. chart, but I didn't really do a deep dive into that, though I think we probably should this year, as this is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Big year for the U.S. So maybe we'll do a show on that later on on the Constitution too. So that's going to be my overall view. How are you going to approach today, Michael?
That's a good question. I've done some readings. We're going to look at also some of the broader trends going on, I think, in our society and perhaps globally. And then maybe whatever comes up, and we'll kind of go from there. So I'm just going to sort of follow your lead.
Okay, that sounds good. So let's start off with the United States 2026. So this year for the United States, I looked at the number it's numerology based on the birth chart of the United States being July 4th. So instead of it like being connected to just the overall numerology of the year, which would in 2026 would be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1. So the U.S. is actually in a 21-3 year, which is really fascinating because when I did the astrology spread, all 4 threes came up, which 4 of a kind, doesn't really come up that often in people's readings. So I think any kind of repetition in predictions is going to make it more, forceful. And so, in fact, one of my first observations about this year in the U.S. is that no matter what area you look at, there's a lot of cards I drew from the left-hand path, 3s, 5s, 8s, queens, and that path tends to be more chaotic. One of the first things I would say, and having the 4 threes, particularly starting with the first house, I have the 3 of Wands. And so to me, there's a lot of questioning this year of the U.S.'s identity within the U.S. itself. Like, who are we? A nervous kind of energy, not sure, what our identity is anymore. And that's the first 3 that I would see. And then the next 3, the 3 threes come up in the 9th, 10th, and 11th house. Actually, no, it's the 8th, 9th, and 10th houses. And so kind of in the chart, it represents more of the upper world, the outer world. And the 8th house is the house of death, psychicism. It's a house of other people's money and taxes. And so there's definitely still some issues going on with tariffs and taxes this year, I'm afraid, because we have the 3 of coins there. And then it's followed by in the 9th house position, which is higher education, foreign lands, law. We have the 3 of swords, which is also another chaotic thing and some uncertainty there. And then also the 10th house, which would be our reputation in the world, which is definitely weakened. It's got the 3 of cups and people are, nervous and afraid. And in fact, there's even the 7th house is the 5 of Wands, which would show our people outside the United States, our allies, or even our open enemies, that there's this kind of nervousness, anxiety because of us this year. So not only are we going to have, unfortunately, quite a bit of instability this year in various ways, but we're definitely impacting the world still. And the positive aspect, though, means that a lot of left-hand pillar cards indicate, people aren't happy. And that if we're unhappy enough, that's where change can come from. So even though we might not experience that kind of change yet, and we'll talk about actually there are a couple areas that do look very positive. People are, across the board, I think people are nervous and unhappy. And I know, Michael, you've seen some trends, I think, in terms of group energy this year, right?
Yeah, and it really does involve a lot of that left pillar energy in the readings that I've been doing, and it really mirrors what's actually going on. And I think one of the things this year is the inability to be dependent upon others. So I think people that are striving to be more creative, more independent, that they're not looking to other people for validation, that they're more self-assured, entrepreneurial perhaps, things like that, I think are going to do well. I think there will be opportunities. But I think that in terms of depending on others, and, we see that globally right now where countries are questioning whether they can depend on America as a strong partner the way that they used to and deciding they need to be more autonomous. And so we're kind of seeing that there. You're seeing it societally here where, again, people are losing their food stamps and so forth, people that are depending on government handouts and whatnot that are struggling because it's being taken away. Of course, the individualism favoring the wealthy, right, and the 1%. But I think that, again, we're going to see that. But on a personal level, I think a lot of it is about taking initiative with things, striving to be independent, striving to chart your own destiny, not worrying what other people think, you're making up your own mind about things, being self-assured. I think that that's the key to kind of trying to work with this year productively. But I think the depending on others is going to be a rough one, and because that's that left-hand pillar energy again. And I think if you're depending on that, I think you could be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I'm going to say it's backed up by some other things that I did that I'm going to talk about a little later, especially the medicine card that I picked. Oh, Lily has something to say. You can hear her. She's saying that's true too. We decided to keep her in the studio because she has the run of the apartment. Basically, we hate to shut her out. So yes, I also feel like there's even more of a loss of confidence from our allies and even people that maybe don't particularly like us. I think spiritually, it's also a difficult year. In terms of, because there's the 5 of Swords is in the 12th house position. And I want to reiterate, this is not using the United States astrological chart. It's a symbolic representation. So just to make sure people understand that. But where I would see some progress, interesting. So in the 5th and 6th house positions, the 5th house represents children, the arts, performance, speculative gambling. And there's some positive things coming that way. So that's that for children. I like that idea. And then for the arts, maybe there's some sort of gain in terms of artists having some control over, what's happening with AI. And again, it's an early stage because it's the Hermit, but still it's showing some ideas and progress in that area. And also the sixth house being the house connected to health. And so I've seen it a couple of places that I feel like the way, even though the premiums are going up, I don't think that's going to last. I think there's going to be a remedy to that. And I think it's supported by this particular layout that I did, that there's, something that will happen to help to create a more fair system again with healthcare. So I think that's an area that actually might be better than people think overall. What do you think about that, Michael, in terms of like the possibility of something changing
I think
around?
one of the interesting things with healthcare, I was just listening to what you were saying, is again, we're still back to that theme of not relying on others, right? And the whole idea that up until now we've relied on the CDC to give us good guidance and good advice as to what to do in terms of our best interest with our health. And now with Knucklehead running it, we can't. They're not making good choices. They're not giving out good information. So now it's incumbent upon us individually to manage our health and to look into it, decide what's healthy for us, what's right for us, that what's dangerous and what isn't. But we can no longer just blindly trust the information we're getting even from the CDC. So I think a lot of that still harkens back to the idea of individualism. Again, even the idea of losing the healthcare subsidies, again, is the idea that we can't be as reliant on handouts and so forth. And again, striving for that self-sufficiency. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that all plays out societally and what that gives rise to.
I agree with that because the Hermit's on that side of the individual, on the right-hand path. And then what I picked for the sixth house position was the Tower. And so I would say there could also be some interesting individuals that help, and perhaps even in this case, there could be some kind of groups, but that might help to lead the way in terms of healthcare, or maybe that could also mean individual states as well are beginning to really think, how can we be more independent all around? So then the other area that seemed really out of balance was the second house, which is our house of values and money. And we have the wheel of fortune there. And obviously that one, considering how we have a problem with insane greed, it's saying that is continuing to be out of balance and sort of, I guess, money grabs being behind other things right now with people that can do that. So unfortunately, that's not necessarily great for the country economically. Probably individuals, yes, like Michael was saying, I think that is true still.
Yeah, I think one of the downsides to the individualism is going to be the lack of compassion, the lack of empathy that we're still seeing as being a big factor in our society. Again, it may not be beneficial to getting beyond this division that we see, them against us. So that could be challenging again because of this. And like you said, the wealthy 1% continuing to become wealthier in terms of that individualism to the detriment of the rest of society. So again, I think that's part of it. But one of the cool things that might happen with it is innovation, right? Where people might start bucking some of the old systems and the old ways of doing things. They want to reestablish something new that's based more on individual liberty and so forth. And so it'll kind of be interesting to see long-term how that plays out. Because again, it really could drive a lot of innovation as well.
Oh, absolutely. That's a really good point, actually. I did want to go back to this emphasis on the threes and Michael talking about the lack of compassion and empathy. Interesting enough, that is one of the antidotes to this year, and it's represented by Jaguar, who I chose for the ally. And Jaguar is all about integrity and impeccability. And so the high end of the left-hand path teaches us about compassion and empathy and understanding. And having that approach, even though sometimes that can seem counterintuitive, I find the animal cards are exactly on point whenever I pick them for myself. How do I approach this particular situation? Am I supposed to be a rabbit or a hawk? And sometimes you'll be like, what? So Jaguar is all about... Also, it's a very, very important cat in many of South America and Mexico. And I thought that might be interesting. Perhaps Mexico may benefit the world this year. I mean, it already is showing it with some of its innovations in the president. So I thought that was just, or sort of that the southern part of the U.S. actually having more power and strength than you might think in the situation. The other thing about Jaguar, which is really interesting, is that Jaguar teaches you how to watch your own energy. And you're meant to stalk your energy and see where are you going so you can sort of pull your energy into yourself. And you're really not supposed to be stuck in the past. So ironically, it's important, of course, for us to understand history, but and the left-hand path likes the past, but it's going to work against us if we allow ourselves to just be stuck there and keep going over, oh, if this hadn't happened, we wouldn't be in this situation. It's about, and it's an energy thing, not a moral thing. So I thought that was really interesting. You can try it for yourself. And then the counter or the adversary or the challenge of this year is armadillo. And that one has to do with boundaries. And that makes a lot of sense when you think of Trump and his ability not to have any boundaries and sort of that idea of boundaries being, not such a great idea. But it could also mean that we have to kind of look at where we have put our own boundaries and to be honest with ourselves, and neither positive or negative. And then also with the Jaguar, it is, it's a predator. So it's more, it'll sort of take initiative and it's more solitary. And so this will be a challenge this year in the US because it seems like, it would be a good idea to always be part of groups. But we have to take care of our own energy so that we understand, and operate from compassion, empathy, and not sort of reactive energy, which unfortunately is one of the shadow sides of the 3s and 5s and even 8s.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I would say too is that because of the tendency for that energy to be super negative this year, and that means pessimistic. So for God's sake, don't listen to all the noise. There's going to be a lot of doomsday people saying this is the end of society as we know it, and the world is going to go up in flames and collapse. And that may not necessarily be true. So be careful with people that are trying to inject fear into the conversations and doubts and worries and so forth. And I think you really do want to think for yourself a lot this year, which means not worrying as much about what you're being told. And so I think really when it comes to all these pundits and so forth, you might want to filter a lot of that out when it comes to how you do things this year.
I totally agree. And that goes to the third house, which is the house of our neighbors, communication, and short trips. And it's also connected to the mind and Mercury, and it's the 8 of Cups, which is interesting because 8 of Cups in the Thoth deck is Saturn and Pisces, which we're just getting out of. And I'm going to talk about that. So that card really can get depressed, like Michael said, and it can have more of a repercussion if you allow yourself to sink into it. And then also maybe just noticing when you're being too much affected by the collective. My father said the other night, who's a very political person, and he read all about the assassination of Kennedy, and he said, I can't watch the news anymore. He says it's all terrible. And I told him, I said, look, I read the news now. I get the AP and I read the headlines. I said, there are some good things going on. Yes, the United States is in a mess, but it's not the only thing going on in life, and it's important that you don't sink into that, the deep side of the 8 of Cups. But the positive thing about the 8 of Cups is it can be finally it's closer to letting go and healing. And so again, and I love the idea of collective healing and allowing that to happen. And also, not feeling like you have to necessarily be involved in everything.
Yeah, for sure. Now, of course, the $1 million questions everyone's going to ask, and our good friend and astrologer, Caroline Marshall, is on the chat. So if she's listening in, maybe she can chime in too on our chat. Is what's going to happen with Trump, and everybody's wondering if he's going to have his downfall this year. Some of the psychics and so forth I've spoken with sort of suggest April, which I'm not really convinced is going to be the case. But in my readings, looking at him, I think August is going to be a very challenging cycle for him, and we'll see what happens. Whether he's removed from office, whether J.D. Vance stages a coup so he gets to be president for a couple of years. whatever might happen. But I think August will be a very interesting time to watch for when it comes to him. And of course, we know his health is probably going to continue to deteriorate as well. But I would look at the late summer and think that's a very interesting energy. And I'm wondering if Caroline has seen anything in her astrology or if you've seen anything in your patterns.
Yeah, I did not. I decided this was too much for this show and that we would actually do maybe something a little different. Another show focused more maybe on Trump and also on the 250th anniversary, which is a huge thing. And I know Caroline was talking about that a couple years ago, even the constitutional crisis. So I think we're going to leave that for another show. Though I will say I did a reading. I don't know. A couple clients always want me to do readings on the United States and the president, and I did see more of a health decline even when it started happening. I saw it like, I don't know, it was like maybe the end of summer. I read and I said, oh, it looks like he's getting much worse. So I'm sort of leaning more right now towards a health crisis, but I'm not sure what time, even based on the horoscope reading I'm looking at. But I think it's because I'm focused more on the U.S. overall.
Yeah, and one of the advantages Krista and I have is, of course, we're doing an awful lot of tarot readings for people. We had an event at the Enchanted Cottage last weekend. We read for about 30 people in an afternoon. And when you do that, you start to see these broader trends. So the energies that we're talking about is reoccurring reading after reading after reading, not necessarily 100%, but enough to be a very noticeable pattern. And I find in doing readings, when that happens, then you're really looking at a more of a societal energy rather than just an individualistic energy that's impacting, broadly our society. And I started seeing this energy a lot, sort of end of last year and certainly to start the new year. So I think that this is just going to be a thing because, as I said, I'm seeing it many, many times, the same pattern now repeated in everybody's readings.
Yeah, it is really interesting. We noticed this years ago, and it's only because we do so many in a row, and you start to feel this sort of energy is infiltrating everyone's reading. Like, why does everyone have this? We saw it even early on, I think, in the 2000s. But I did want to go back a little bit to some of the astrology this year, and I didn't necessarily look at the chart for the U.S., but many people know that Saturn and Neptune. Neptune is already in the sign of Aries, and Saturn is just about to enter Aries and stay there for a while. And so and because there's so many Saturn cards in the astrology horoscope spread that I did, it makes sense that Saturn is a big player for the U.S. this year. And one of the reasons is, so we have some dates for you. Basically, it's February 15th, Saturn enters Aries for good. I think it's already entered once, but it retrograded back into Pisces. And so then for good, for the next 2.5-3 years. And then it retrogrades July 27th, 14 degrees of Aries, and goes direct December 11th. And one of the reasons why Saturn will impact the U.S. chart is because it's going to basically square a lot of several major planets in the United States at different points. So the U.S. chart that I use, which is a popular one on astro.com, there's Venus is in 3 degrees, 6 minutes of Cancer, Jupiter's 5 degrees, 56 minutes of Cancer, and then Sun in Cancer at 13 degrees, 19. And there's another chart very similar to that. But anyway, it's going to be aspecting the 7th house of the United States. And squares really are challenging for people. You can't always see what's coming. Saturn, of course, is the, disciplinarian. It will reward you if you put the efforts in, but you definitely have to take Saturn very serious. And it can also perhaps explain people's depression a little bit because Saturn can be depressive. It's connected, even in palmistry, it's connected to the father, discipline, and agriculture, though, interesting. So I don't know if there's going to be something going on with that this year. But Saturn is like, even though Neptune's very important too, and there are times Saturn and Neptune are going to be conjunct each other, but I would say because of the way the cards are spinning out, I think maybe Saturn energy is affecting us in many different ways this year.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be true. I'm going to yield to your greater wisdom and understanding of astrology than I do. So I'm not sure I've looked at that deeply into it with tarot, that particular aspect, but I certainly trust your judgment.
Yeah, well, you understand Saturn though because you have many planets in Capricorn. So your understanding and experience of Saturn, Saturn has that sense of responsibility. It has a sense of duty. It's how also I think Liz Green talks about sort of it connected to how we process and think a little bit. And there is this completely irrational energy, I think, around our thinking this year. Like, that's not really new though. So as a country, so I think it's important, like Michael was saying, that we sort of see this year as powerful for the individual and taking responsibility for our own energies, no matter what. Um, and the thing about having the jaguar as the main ally, cats tend to be more silent. Um, they're not like, if it was crow, then communication would be a big thing, So, but cats know, and then so the idea that maybe sometimes it's good to observe and not necessarily feel like you have to always respond to things. And then also jaguars are very adaptable. They can climb trees, they can swim, and again, that idea of the individual, they're more loners.
Yeah, and then I would also say that if we're looking at Saturn or Capricorn, the idea of taking the long view this year, which can be another part of that left pillar energy too, right? The idea that I'm not going to look for the quick fix or the get rich quick thing, but we're going to take our time and look at the long view when going forward. So, persistence and one step at a time and so forth is probably going to be a good thing for a lot of folks this year.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I totally agree with that too. And then there was two other cards. I haven't figured out what they really mean to me. So we have only two of the court cards in the 12 card reading for the U.S. And one is the Queen of Swords, one of my favorites, and the Queen of Wands. And the Queen of Swords is in the fourth house position, which is the house of family and roots, but also it's a very psychological house. And then the 11th house is the Queen of Wands, which is one of the queens that's both masculine and feminine because it's it's on the side of the left-hand pillar, but it's got the wands. And obviously it's very electrical. And by the way, in the Thoth deck, there's a cat depicted, a leopard in that one. So that was a nice sort of synchronicity. So I sort of feel like the fourth, maybe there are people underneath trying to manipulate us because queens are extremely good at that. And, manipulation can be for good or bad reasons. And I think that's why we have to stop and really think for ourselves and really not just react to things all the time, no matter what, because I think that's going to be important. Or you've got people that may or may not be completely in the front, though queens hold power. They're not often the person in the front. Maybe the Queen of Wands, I don't know, could a little bit, but so players behind the scenes trying to manipulate us psychologically in the 11th house, being in groups, large groups, and also connected to dreams, our dreams and hopes. So I would say, and the emphasis of the Queen of Wands is also the individual determining, what is my hope for this country? What is it I'm supposed to be thinking about and the goals? So I feel there has to be sort of, not has to be, but it's a good suggestion not to really consider things before taking action.
Yeah. I think it's interesting what Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, was saying at the Economic Forum recently. And that's to not sort of fight the idea that there's going to be the emergence of a new world order, he called it. And I think that that's an interesting concept. And I think that the Trump administration probably has it completely backwards, and maybe not be a shock for some of our listeners. But I think that their attitude is you can't get along without us. And it's the exact opposite. It's really about countries discovering their own strength, their own autonomy, their own independence, and breaking free from that shackle of you need us, that the United States is always sort of depended on by being a juggernaut when it comes to the economy. So the idea that these countries will strike their own trade deals with China and Europe and so forth and are striving to become much more autonomous does fit the theme. But the whole idea that you can't get along without us, I think, is the exact opposite of the energies this year.
I think that's really, really good. I love that because it really kind of sums up when I look at the different cards is there is actually quite a lack of leadership in this particular 12 card spread. there's so that's interesting, and it's a little bit more anarchy with the kind of cards. I did also want to add with the armadillo being the challenge. So armadillo is about proper boundaries. And so as a challenge, I mean, it could be literally about boundaries because we all know what's going on with Trump trying to take over the world. But, the thing is, armadillo positively knows how to work with boundaries. And when you do with the armadillo, your intuition is really strong. And then also the armadillo, interesting enough, can be associated with the medieval times. And it's true that some people want to take us way back to the medieval days, where women stayed home and had babies. And, so that's not a good thing. It's not the honorable knight and the code of the knight, which is good for armadillo. So I thought, that fits with the cards too, that idea of like, we want to go backwards in the country. And of course, people are resisting that.
Yeah, I saw some articles today about that actually, that this one Republican woman in Vermont, I think, or New Hampshire, one of the two, that was advocating for going back to segregated schools. And I thought, wow, that's a step back. And then Thiel, I think, the multi-billionaire that has been financing Vance mostly, talking about that things started to go sideways when women got the right to vote and that women should be stripped of the right to vote and so forth. So when you're talking about a step back, that's a big step back, and I don't think it's going to happen.
No.
But certainly there are people out there almost advocating for a return to what there was 150 years ago.
Absolutely. And that's actually, even though I'm not talking much about Pluto and Aquarius, that's one of the negative things about Pluto and Aquarius. If you read Jeffrey Wolf Green's book, he talks about there will be a group of people that want things to stay the same or go backwards. So everyone thinks Aquarius is always innovative, but it's ruled by Saturn, and it can also be conservative. So that idea that, trying to push things sort of back and maybe, maybe they had a little success, but I agree with Michael. I don't think it's going to get to that point at all.
Yeah, I hope not anyway, because I just can't even imagine that would happen. But there certainly are those ultra-conservative groups out there that have a lot of influence right now. They're advocating for that kind of policy. And I don't know if you see that in other countries as much, maybe a little bit, but certainly in this country you do. And, again, I don't think it's going to amount to a whole lot, but I think it'll make people nervous until things get more fully resolved and stabilized in a more positive direction. And of course, what we do know is that everything is cyclical and the pendulum will always swing. So at some point, again, it'll be a much more liberal government and so forth in this country. People will rebel against some of the extremes that are going on. And generally, Americans don't like extremes, extreme left, extreme right. They tend to be a very center, maybe even slightly right of center society. So for a lot of people, extremism is not something that they're going to find terribly appealing.
Yeah, I think you're right. And like I said, even though I don't think it's going to be an easy year, I think the discomfort of this year is the beginning of sort of going back to some balance, so we might not get there this year, but I would say that, the breakdown is necessary at this point, it seems like, from what I can tell.
Yeah, sometimes I think people have to shock themselves into sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
I see that a lot. And that can be trying to awaken that 8 energy again, right, and get through to it. The thunderclap. I think that it's going to be a tricky one this year. It really is. And as I said, I think for people especially that are not striving to be more autonomous and independent, it's going to be especially difficult. So that really, to me, is the key this year, is to stand on your own, do your own thing, be your own person, and so forth. But don't rely so much on others, whether that's society, even on a personal level. I think it's, charting a course towards more of an individual empowerment is going to be what really tries to create a positive energy as much as possible this year. And resisting that is going to make it challenging.
Well, what's interesting is this idea of becoming more autonomous also fits with the evolution of the United States chart. So Saturn and Neptune are still, I think, at the end of the 3rd house in the actual natal chart. And the 4th house, which has Chiron and Aries, which is being hit again, it's going to, especially Neptune being there for quite a long time, it would indicate that it's time to look at sort of the emotional, reason, not really the psychological things about the founding of the United States, looking at, things more from that deep perspective, kind of taking charge of our own shadows, even within the country. And so I think the Jaguar, because it's so much about integrity and impeccable energy, it means, sort of taking your responsibility for your own energy this year, and to stay in integrity no matter what. So even if you're tempted to take a shortcut because it's the right thing, it's the other side is it's sort of like when people were over the top, celebrating the assassination of Charlie Kirk, that were progressives. That was just completely wrong. A good human being doesn't do that. It's not a kind of thing you celebrate. We want to stay compassionate, empathetic, and act out of that, like Martin Luther King was able to do, and Thich Nhat Hanh was able to do. And I think in order to do that, that idea of Michael saying of not only, being independent, but taking responsibility for our own energy when we go out there, that does have an impact.
Yeah, I think another thing that's going to impact people economically this year, and just again, it's because of the dependency aspect, is I would expect to see more big plant closures, large scale layoffs, things like that. So I think we've seen some of that, but I think that's the tip of the iceberg. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a significant dip in employment this year, especially, those traditional factories and so forth, which again, I think are going to be experiencing a challenging aspect this year. And as I said, unfortunately, I think a lot of people may be looking at layoffs and job losses and plant closures and things like that as the year progresses. I think on a bigger scale than what we've already seen.
Yeah, that I would say that fits with the kind of cards that I see for the United States this year too. I agree with that. Now, I also wanted to, before, since we're getting on with the show, I did want to talk a little bit about Bakersfield, since we've been here almost 2 years now. And we really love living here, and trying to get to know, the whole of Bakersfield. And so I thought it'd be fun to do a horoscope spread for it. And boy, what a year Bakersfield has ahead of it. Some really excellent cards. I mean, just so different from the other country. I was a little bit taken aback, to tell you the truth, because obviously we've been hit by ICE and the deportation things, but nevertheless, there's a lot of destiny cards. There's an innovation in the second house with the Ace of Swords, which would bring new ideas and thoughts into how Bakersfield can make money. And what's interesting was at the end of November, I was at a UU lecture where a woman was talking about the energy industry here from a much more, I think, insider view of it. And Kern County is, of course, renewing oil drilling permits in 2026. And after Governor Newsom is allowing that. So I think it's connected to the oil industry. But what I learned in the lecture was that Kern County is a renewable energy superpower, which I don't know anything about it other than I know there's oil here. And it has over 180 renewable projects. It's got the largest windmill in the nation. It's called the wind capital of the nation, and has spent over $80 billion invested in Kern's renewable energy. So the reason I think that it's connected to just energy in general and not just the oil wells, which nevertheless could help the United States, is that when I look at sort of the upper cards, the ninth house, the 10th house, it shows it has, Bakersfield has the ability to impact the larger world for good reason. So it's got Prince of Wands and the universe there. So I thought that was really interesting. I also think there is some sort of growth in women's health here and health around children. So it's even possible there could be some, development in terms of maybe some institution or buildings or something more like that. But I would say there's some positive growth in just helping women and children in their health. I think that would be one, because it's the Empress, and that definitely could be women in pregnancy and children in the 6th house position. I would say the other interesting thing, it seems to me Bakersfield becoming a little less conservative. And that's because of the cards. And also that does seem to be true. We've been watching and reading the Bakersfield Californian, and we're always surprised at all the people that don't like Trump openly, and the opinions against him. So I think there's a sort of shift a little bit towards Bakersfield being more. I think it's still going to be more moderate, but I think there's a little bit more less conservative. And then I also think there's a really interesting connection to Bakersfield in California. And there's a couple reasons why. One is when I picked the ally, it's the bear. And the bear, of course, is connected to the symbol of California and the idea that Newsom is allowing, or actually they passed a law. It wasn't just him, but he agreed with it. The bear, it's similar to the United States. The bear does stand on its own. And the bear has, it's considered to have natural wisdom. So sometimes the bear is called the shaman to the shamans. And so if you have the bear as a totem, like Michael has polar bear, if you're born with that and it's one of your main totems, often you have a natural wisdom that you don't have to earn in this lifetime. I think the trick is to really trust it, though. So the bear is very powerful in that way. And then what is its challenge or adversary is the wolf. So that is really interesting because normally I like the wolves, but perhaps that can have to do with certain kinds of packs, like because wolf pack, there can be certain groups that would be, difficult to sort of deal with. But the other thing I always like to reread The Wolf because there's so much in Ted Andrews, and I'd forgotten that wolves are very ritualistic. And so it could be a year where you're sort of not supposed to in Bakersfield do the rituals in the same way. Like if you're part of a group, maybe you need to innovate how you do your rituals. And also, of course, there's this whole hierarchy in the wolf pack that's very sophisticated. They're very socially sophisticated, and you have the alpha wolf and the beta wolf and all that. So, but again, there's this sort of group energy. No, standing on your own is the bear. So Bakersfield is also has that a little bit. But in a way, I look at the card and say, well, I think I'm glad I'm in Bakersfield this year.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And it is really interesting how, again, even the animal totem medicine cards are showing that favoring of individualism. Because as you said, the wolf is going to be a pack animal, whereas the bear is going to be much more individualistic. And I just think that's the key this year to everything. I think whether it's our personal lives where, again, I want to sort of be my own person. And maybe, there can be some isolation, I suppose, in that. But whether it's societally, again, where it's favoring individualism, I think that is going to be the number one theme this year, is to strive for that more individualistic state and standing on our own, thinking for ourselves, as I said, self-affirming. I don't care. I don't need somebody else to tell me I'm a good person. I trust myself, and so forth, being self-determined, making your own decisions. I think that those things are going to be the key. And as I said, whether it's on a small level with our personal dynamics, whether it's on a broader societal level, and quite often you'll see that energy playing out on all different levels. So I think that is the big key this year.
Yeah, and another thing I want to say about Bakersfield that's really interesting, I forgot the bear is also connected to healing. So if you have as a bear totem, sometimes you have natural healing abilities and also dreaming. And you can often have healing dreams with the bear. And so I do feel there's something, I know that Bakersfield, gets a lot, sort of a bad reputation, but I think that's going to change. And I do think there's something changing here around health because the Empress card and the bear. And then the other thing is I do think that Bakersfield might have some notable recognition in like surgical areas and also perhaps the paranormal. So the 4 discs is in the 8th house. And so Bakersfield has a lot of paranormal people, a lot of ghost hunters. Recently, there was someone that came, was Josh from, what was the show? He came and gave a talk. But I'm thinking there can be more attention and notoriety because the 8th house being connected to surgery specifically, and also the occult and the paranormal and recognition. And there does, I will say, our experience of dealing with cardiology and cardiologists here, they do seem to be excellent in Bakersfield, like that particular area. And then higher education. So we have the Prince of Wands in the 9th house in Bakersfield. And to me, it also shows they might really stand up for their students that are more international. But there could also be some really interesting ideas and progress in the colleges here in Bakersfield, and also any relationships they have internationally there in terms of, exchange students and things like that. I feel like that could be, it's kind of lit up for me. So I'm curious to see what will happen there. And I know that Bakersfield College, what was that? They had a really interesting, they had something like a class connected to the tarot. It wasn't this year, but it was really interesting class too. I forget what it was, but it wasn't offered this year. I came across it by accident. So anyway, I think magic is, because the magician came up in the seventh house position. So literally magic. There's no doubt the magician also represents magic, particularly for Aleister Crowley when it's so maybe magic is taking shape here in Bakersfield. So it might be really good for more of the occult, the paranormal, Enchanted Cottage, people like us, the paranormal. It might be a really good year for them.
Yeah, I think again that the emphasis on individualism, I think, is going to be good for non-traditional things. And so, like you said, paranormal stuff, occult stuff, things of that nature, I think are going to be a greater interest to people. And also, I think from a broad point of view, I think religion in general, people may look to move away from some of the more organized, traditional religious institutions and start to want to do their own thing more. So things like paganism and so forth, we may see a bit of a surge in people looking at things that are much more related to individualism. But I also think, as I said, and health, as you said, I think working on health, I think the healthier we are, the more independent we are, and the less healthy, the more dependent. So again, striving for independence means that we should be dealing with our health issues and trying to strengthen ourselves and live a healthier life. I think that's going to be key this year. But again, I think that you're right. I think that seeing people taking a greater interest in very non-traditional hobbies, interests, things of that nature, careers, I think is going to be a part this year that you'll really see a lot of growth in those areas.
Yeah, and I think, there's different ways to be political in life. And I'm not going to say one is better than the other. But sometimes living a certain kind of life is political. So living a life where you take care of yourself and that you don't just, do what the doctor tells you. You do things that are for your physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. That impacts everybody. We all like to be around people that are also happy and are, feeling comfortable in their skins, but often will lead to other things. Often if I take up a health cause, it can lead to political change, actually. So I think there's a lot of ways one can be political in life. And in Bakersfield, what I'm also noticing in the cards is the first house is the lust or strength card, which means Bakersfield knows its identity. And one of the things I remember reading about the founding of Bakersfield was that the person that founded it, and not there's no like colonial history here, but had the intention that it be an oasis for people and animals. I found that really curious because when we came here, all of us, Michael, my husband, my father, we all had issues of health. And also we were exhausted from all of the years of whatever we've been going through. We've all been working on our health and healing. And Lily had an extraordinary healing happen here in Bakersfield where she got her eyesight back. I mean, think about that. That was the intention of Bakersfield, the identity. And I feel like that maybe some of that can emerge more over time and even this year.
Yeah, I think that that's very true. And then I think that because there is going to be that, push for individualism, I can see that creating conflict. Or again, as people choose to pursue a more individualistic path, and the people that are into the orthodoxy, the religious right, will get into conflict with the people that are trying to pursue more non-traditional things. And it can very much easily create a significant conflict between the old school and the new school. And I think that can be chaotic. I think I'm hopefully not violent at times, but certainly conflicted. And it's going to be very interesting. And then the concern I would have with it again is that does that create a furthering of division, them against us and so forth, which we've seen being very prevalent over the last couple of years. I certainly don't think it's going to be helpful to healing division, as the old orthodoxy fights the new nonconformist way. So I expect to see it continue to be difficult when it comes to people just sort of coming together with any kind of an agreement.
I think that's very true. And I think as a whole, unfortunately, I think that the idea of balance and connection is not very strong as a whole in the country. But interesting enough, in Bakersfield, there's enough here. There can be more of a coming together than expected, I think. However, I did want to mention in the 12th house, we have the Nine of Cups, which everyone thinks, oh, the Nine of Cups is the, wish fulfilling card. Well, it's a truthful card. And the 12th house represents not only spirituality, but large, isolated institutions like prisons, deportation centers, hospitals. So to me, it can be quite painful, but it means the truth can come out about those kinds of places in Bakersfield. And I know that needs to happen because of the group we belong to, the UU group. They do a lot with the immigrants here, and they have for a long time. And so there's terrible things going on in the newer deportation centers. So I feel like even though it can be painful, there can be some reckoning of those kind of centers this year here in Bakersfield.
Yeah, I think very possibly so. I think that another thing too is that if there's the push towards individualism in our society a great deal, if that strips a lot of power away from the old orthodoxy, so they hemorrhage membership and so forth, it will reduce their clout politically and so forth. So I think that that's going to be very interesting to see how that power dynamic shifts, and if it does significantly shift to favor progression and individualism a great deal more. So, it'll be fascinating to see how this all plays out throughout the year, and it'll be very interesting to watch. I'm hoping it's not going to be too painful or violent or difficult, but I definitely think what we emerge as at the end of the year will be very different from where we start the year.
I think that's a fair statement too. And I'm afraid there still will be more. I think there's more chaos within the United States rather than externally, even. So I know that a lot of people, understandably, are nervous about starting wars with other countries. And there has been some evidence with Venezuela. But the strongest likelihood this year is still within the U.S. itself. And that, I think, has to do with ICE and its ability to just create mayhem wherever it goes. So I hope it sort of comes to some kind of culmination. Perhaps we'll look more closely as we get to the midterms and see if that's going to affect change. But I do think more conflict is likely within the United States this year than externally between countries, other than the other countries pulling away, like Michael said, from us. So I think we're going to be losing some valuable things that we have gotten from other countries.
Yeah, and I think that, again, with the energies I'm looking at, in the long run, ICE as an organization, people like that are probably going to end up on the wrong side of history because, again, that's still trying to exert dominance, is still trying to exert obedience, which is, in my opinion, on the way out. And so I think in the long run, I think that it's a hanging on to that failing energy.
Yep, I think that's absolutely true. And like I said, there's enough unhappy cards that we can't continue this path, forever, because there are enough groups of people on any side, I think, that are unhappy. I don't think, like, the thing I feel that I didn't feel there was, like, in the cards themselves, sort of a partisanship. I felt like it was people suffering that were tired of whatever aspect of the suffering was, whether it was economically, whether it's, their own neighborhoods are being destroyed, whether it's just, one few people having all of the resources. So, the power of the left-hand pillar is the collective. That is the power. And I think there's more and more people unhappy enough to say, we can't keep going this way.
Yeah, I think that that's very true. And I think that, again, you can look at things like, for example, in the 60s, the movement towards the hippie movement, individualism, things like that may flourish again. And we'll see more of that kind of energy. So again, I think it's going to reshape our society. I don't know if it'll all happen this year. I may be looking over the next decade to see this all play out. But I certainly think that that's going to be the general movement. And I guess, again, my individual advice to people this year: relax, be yourself, and do your thing, right? I mean, that's probably the best way to go. And I think if you do that, I think you can find a lot of good in this year. So, and again, try not to let yourself be controlled by fear, by external pressure, things of that nature. Just be yourself and do your thing.
Yes. I think that's a great idea. And then also, I think I mentioned it before, but I want to emphasize that in the US, it does seem like performance and the arts can actually be a healthy part of our society. And there might be some new, interesting, innovative artists coming out this year in the US. And that also, I think it's sort of encouraging us to be creative this year and not to, because the world is not a certain way, not to think if I want to create, if I want to act, if I want to sing, don't wait this year. There's no reason you shouldn't do that, and it doesn't have to necessarily be, a reaction to things, though the hermit would sometimes want to have a message, like this is my message to the world that I feel strongly about. So I want to encourage people also to, besides taking care of your health and the autonomy, but also to be creative this year.
Yeah, and if you think about it, the arts and music, literature has always been at the forefront of innovation in society and changes in culture and so forth, and so I think that those things are going to be important. And because again, if we look at music in the 60s, if we look at fashion in the 60s, you look at all the entertainment in general, that really has shaped consciousness to a great degree and for decades afterwards. So I think that the arts are going to be instrumental in what we emerge as, certainly going forward.
The other thing that now we're talking about it, I finally feel like I understand the Queen of Wands in the 11th house. What's missing a lot of times right now are visionaries, people that really inspire us and really get us excited. And it's connected to the hermit. In astrology, you would look at both the 5th and 11th house together. So it seems to me some of our visionaries that can really inspire and uplift us and give us the direction of our dreams this year will come through the 5th house. And that would be also children, young people, that could be very inspiring and really be part of the destiny of the United States. So that's where I'm looking at the leadership might come from, as well as people that work with the mind, the deep mind, the psychological mind, people in consciousness because of the Queen of Swords. That can also be where we get information. So not just metaphysics, but also I think, we all would agree that there's a lot of brilliant minds in physics itself, but looking for some of our answers and some of the leadership coming from those areas this year.
Yeah, and certainly the youth have always been drivers of change, not so much us old folk that are set in our ways. So again, and I think that that's going to be important.
Yeah.
And so we'll see what happens. But again, my only real concern is the conflict, the pushback. And that's going to be it happened in the 60s again, we saw it at Kent State, places like that. So, again, it will likely happen here too. But ultimately, I think progress is hard to stop. And I think that this movement is going to gather steam. And I think eventually the old structures are going to have to yield and give way to it. And so I think that's ultimately where we're headed as a society. And like I said, apply that to individualism as well, right? This is me doing my own thing and being my own person. And that's the goal. And so again, the more things I do like that, probably the better things are going to go in life. And the more I resist that, the harder it's going to get until I start doing that. So I think lessons are taught through reward or punishment, right? If I'm doing the right thing, I get rewarded. If I'm doing the wrong thing, then I get my head beat against the wall till I start doing the right thing. So I think strive to be your own person this year. I think that is the ultimate key to anything really super positive coming out of this year.
Yes, I totally agree. And remember that integrity. I know it's good. It's good to act with integrity, first with yourself and your own energy, and then watch and see if any of the animals cross your path, either literally or symbolically, because they often will, whether it's for the United States jaguar and armadillo, or for Bakersfield, California, the bear or the wolf. So see if they show up in any way or shape, and you'll see the message yourself, because they're super interesting and interactive. So I think that pretty much sums up what I want to say at this point. We may revisit some of these issues later on this spring, I think, because it's a really intense year. But we are really happy to be back on the air. And thank you all for tuning in. Join us next time as we continue to explore the esoteric and the obscure. Have a magical day.